Hi, this is a recording of a presentation that I gave at the Interpreting for Discourse conference in Warsaw in December 2025. And the title of the presentation is Ostension, Addressees and Audiences, a Relevance Theoretic Perspective. Much of the work that exists in relevance theory pragmatics, to this point at least, has focused on understanding communication between one speaker and one hearer. So we think about how a speaker constructs their utterance with a particular addressee in mind, and we think about how that addressee interprets the message from their perspective as the addressee. However, real communication often involves other participants. So if we imagine, for example, the scenario depicted in this lovely stock photograph here, we might have 3, 4 or 5 people sitting around in some kind of group discourse. Now, one individual may be addressing a specific other member within that group, but in some sense the other members of the group are part of that discourse. They are ratified or official, or there's various ways in which we might think of them. Those other participants are following the discourse, they're interpreting what's being said, and they are involved in a way that other people perhaps in the same room are not. Now, if we start by simply describing who these participants might be, we have, first of all, addressees. So the addressees are the people or the person towards whom an utterance is addressed. Then we have those other, what we can think of as third parties, who are part of the group discourse but aren't being directly addressed at that point in the discourse. These, as I said, ratified or official in some way. It's likely that in a group discourse, one particular individual will rotate between those roles. So they will speak, they will be addressed, and they may be a third party. Then we also have people who may, as I say, be in the same vicinity, but aren't part of that group discourse. So they may be in the same physical space, or if we are talking about digital communication, they may be in the same online space. But these people are not ratified members of the discourse, so we will call those overhearers. They can understand potentially what's going on, they can interpret the utterances to some degree at least, but they aren't part of the discourse. If the communicators, particularly the speaker, is aware of those overhearers, then we consider them to be bystanders. So bystanders are overhearers of whom the communicator is aware. But we may also have what we can think of as eavesdroppers. So that's overhearers who the speaker is not aware of. These are the main kind of descriptive roles that we find in this kind of group discourse. And my aim is to analyse these roles from the perspective of relevance theory and to think about how they relate to the speaker and how they relate to the acts of ostension that are taking place during the group interaction. Now, various frameworks exist out there already to map and look at and describe these roles. I'm obviously not the first person to have noticed this. It's something that's come up for many years in discussion in pragmatics and discourse analysis. And on the screen now is a table, a summary table taken from Dynal 2010, which summarises some of these main existing approaches. And you'll see there are various people who have thought about this issue, some big names as well, so Hyams, Goffman, Levinson, Bell, Clark, and so on. And it looks like a very complicated table, but actually if you look at it more closely, they more or less cover the same roles, those roles that I've just described. The labels are slightly different in each case. They call each thing something slightly different. And in some cases, the line between one role and another is drawn in a slightly different place, or there's an extra distinction made. But broadly speaking, these accounts more or less align. The motivation behind the classification and behind where those lines are drawn does vary across the different accounts. And so while I'm not proposing any radical distinctions in my framework that aren't covered elsewhere, I am suggesting that relevance theory can motivate these distinctions in a cognitively plausible manner. Now, the last column you'll see on the chart says here at the top, which is Dinah's own account. And she, like many of the others, draws some key distinctions. So she makes a distinction between ratified and unratified participants. So broadly speaking, those that are in the discourse officially and those that aren't. And in particular, she distinguishes, it's a very important distinction between a ratified third party, a member of that group discourse, and an unratified bystander. And Dinah does this on the basis of the attitude that the speaker assumes towards the hearer. Most notably, whether the speaker intends to communicate meanings to him or her. And so according to Dinah, this distinction between ratified third person and unratified bystander is all about intentions. And I very much agree with her on this. But then she goes on to say something that's maybe a little bit surprising to me, and that she says that she thinks this position or this proposal, if you can see it under the little video, is controversial. And this surprised me because from a relevance theoretic perspective, this idea that these distinctions are driven by intentions doesn't seem controversial at all. And as I'm going to try to show, these different participant roles actually fall out quite naturally if we take intentions seriously and if we take those intentions of the speaker into consideration. So to explain why this is and how this works, I'm going to draw on 4 key relevance theoretic assumptions. The first of these is the presumption of optimal relevance that is carried by all ostensive acts of communication. So this assumption that not just utterances have this presumption that they will be optimally relevant, but in fact any ostensive acts carry this presumption. The second assumption is an assumption that is stated in the original presentation of relevance, but which I think is often overlooked. And this is the idea that addressees are the individuals whose cognitive environment the communicator intends to modify. So almost a definition of what it means to be an addressee. Communication is an attempt to modify a cognitive environment of an addressee. The third assumption is the assumption that showing is an ostensive act of communication. Showing triggers expectations of relevance, and it triggers the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure in just the same way that producing an utterance does. And then the fourth assumption is the idea that any perceptible stimulus, including another ostensive act, can be used as an ostensive stimulus. We're going to come back to that in a moment, and we will see that because of this, because you can use an ostensive stimulus as an ostensive stimulus, ostensive acts can be layered one within another. Now, these 4 assumptions are going to combine in my analysis and underpin my framework for participant roles in non-didactic discourse. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to present what I see as a relevance theoretic reinterpretation of these roles. I will argue that the roles are determined by 2 key factors. The first is whether the speaker is aware of them, aware of the participant that is, and then most crucially, what the speaker's intentions are towards that participant. And we'll be able to pull apart all of these different roles and define them based on these 2 factors. Okay, so let's start with addressees. That's perhaps what we're most familiar within relevance theory. I'm going to argue that in group discourse there are two types of addressee. A second party addressee that is directly addressed by an ostensive act, let's say an utterance in this case, and third party addressees who are ratified participants but who are not directly addressed. However, they are still addressees because they are still intended to interpret the exchange, and the speaker, the communicator, is still trying to modify their cognitive environment. So it comes back to that definition of addressee that I mentioned a moment ago. So let's remind ourselves of that. Addressees are those individuals whose cognitive environments the communicator is intending to modify. Okay, so in group conversations, say we've got 3 or more people around a table, the speaker is aiming to modify everyone's cognitive environment, perhaps in different ways, but not just the cognitive environment of the person who is being directly addressed. Okay, let's look at an example. So let's say we have Jane, Helen and Susanna, and they are talking. Maybe they're chatting in a cafe, sitting around the same table, and Helen asks Susanna a question. She says, "Will you be in class on Saturday?" And Susanna replies, "I have to visit my parents in Canada." So Helen has asked Susanna a direct question, and Susanna has replied to that direct question. And those two utterances are first level ostensive acts directed to each other. So Helen is addressing Susanna with a first level ostensive act, and Susanna replies addressing Helen in the same way. And each participant will interpret the other's utterance with the presumption of optimal relevance, following the relevance theoretic comprehension procedure, and so on. Helen's likely to conclude that Susanna won't be attending class on Saturday because she's going to be in Canada. So far, this looks like a simple one hearer, one speaker exchange. But we also have Jane in the discourse context. Jane is present. Helen and Susanna produce their utterances deliberately and openly in front of her. And in doing so, they perform a second level ostensive act. They are showing their first level utterances to Jane. This act of showing is itself communicative, and it's aiming to modify Jane's cognitive environment. So Jane is an addressee. She's a third party addressee in this case. Now, this idea that ostensive acts can be layered one within another isn't new. So Sperber and Wilson introduced this idea back in 1987 when discussing fiction. So they talked about, for example, if you have a play at the theatre, let's say, you have 2 characters who are speaking to each other on the stage, and that exchange, so they're performing first level ostensive acts to each other, but that exchange between those 2 characters is then shown to an audience via a second level ostensive act. And this creates layers of ostensive communication. And here's how they describe it. They say, a communicative intention is an informative intention about an informative intention, making it possible for a communicative intention itself to be the object of a second order or nth order communicative intention. In other words, a first level act of ostensive communication can serve as an ostensive stimulus for a second level act of ostensive communication. So that's exactly what's happening in this example. Helen and Susanna are producing first level acts addressed to each other, while simultaneously performing a second level act of showing these utterances to Jane. So there are 2 layers, speaking to the individual and showing that speaking to the third party. So in this non-didactic discourse, we have 2 types of addressees, second party and third party. First level ostensive acts are addressed to a second party addressee, and then they can, in some instances, be shown to a third party. This act of showing is itself an ostensive act. It's a second level ostensive act. Now, this showing of the exchange to Jane is an ostensive act because it is intended to lead to the modification of Jane's cognitive environment as a third party. But how does it do this? How does it achieve relevance? How does this second level act achieve relevance? Well, there are various ways, and as with all ostensive acts, the route to relevance will be guided and constrained by considerations of relevance. Now, in some cases, the informational content is going to be relevant. So Jane may just find it useful to know that Susanna won't be at the class on Saturday. She might just update her assumptions, and this will be useful. It will have other implications perhaps for her. However, in other cases, even if the information isn't relevant, the act of producing them and letting somebody else see may be relevant for social reasons. And here is how I phrase this in the paper that I'm currently working on. I am saying, even if no other information is relevant to Jane, the very fact that Helen and Susanna are conversing openly in front of her makes it manifest that she is included in the discourse and perhaps welcome to contribute. By showing their exchange to Jane, Helen and Susanna are communicating that she is part of the ongoing interaction. So as Sperber and Wilson have noted, ostension often has a social dimension to it. A key difference between plain information transfer and ostension is the signalling of social relations, social alignment, social interactions. It can be about maintaining social interaction as much or as well as transmitting information. We'll come back to that idea in a moment when we consider another category of participant. Now let's set aside addressees and think about the other main group that we talked about, overhearers. Now these participants differ from the third party because the communicator has no intention of modifying their cognitive environment. Now that doesn't mean their cognitive environments won't be modified. Perhaps the people sitting at the next table can hear Helen and Susanna and Jane chatting and they find the conversation particularly interesting. Perhaps it has cognitive effects for them. That may well be the case. But the speakers, Helen, Jane and Susanna, they aren't trying to influence those overhearers. They aren't trying to modify their cognitive environments. Now, overhearers fall into two categories. As we said earlier, the first category is bystanders. So bystanders are overhearers that the speaker is aware of. And this distinction is important because between the bystanders and the eavesdroppers that we'll mention in a moment, because this awareness can affect the utterance. If you know somebody can overhear you, then you may change the way you produce your utterance. Perhaps you'll speak lower, so to try to stop them hearing you, or you might use vague language. Perhaps if children are present, you might avoid swearing, for instance. So the speaker might be impacted, and the hearer has to allow for, and by the hearer I mean addressee in this case, the addressee has to allow for the fact that the speaker may be making this allowance in their interpretation of the utterance. So they might understand why somebody is speaking more quietly or whispering or talking slightly more vague terms because they know they can be overheard. So we've got our overhearer, bystander. We also have eavesdroppers. Eavesdroppers are not known to the speaker. So the speaker and perhaps also the addressees are unaware that somebody else can hear them and potentially interpret what they are saying. Because they are not known, they have no effect on the communicative act directly. The final group that I want to consider is what I'm going to call covert addressees. Remember that addressees are individuals whose cognitive environment the speaker intends to modify. A covert addressee, I'm suggesting, is someone that the speaker aims to influence. They want to modify their cognitive environment, but they want to do so covertly. That is, without making that intention mutually manifest. So for this example, imagine that Olivia and Louisa are sitting on a train. It's cold. The window is open and a stranger is sitting next to the window. Olivia and Louisa would like the stranger to close the window, but instead of asking directly, they say the following to each other. So Olivia says to Louisa, "Gosh, it's a bit chilly." And Louisa replies, "Yes, I wish I brought my coat." So what's going on here? Well, I'm suggesting that the stranger, the man sitting next to the window, is in fact a covert addressee. So what's happening here? Well, Olivia and Louisa are performing first level ostensive acts to each other, and they are showing these utterances to the stranger. They are doing it deliberately. They intend to modify his cognitive environment, but they intend for this intention to be hidden or covert, at least not overt. Their intention is not mutually manifest. They do not want their intention to become mutually manifest. Now, the stranger, of course, may suspect that the performance is for his benefit, but the key thing is that the speakers avoid making this explicit. Why might they do this? Well, if they asked directly, if they said to the stranger, "Excuse me, would you close the window?" It might work out, but it's socially quite a high risk strategy. The stranger might comply, but might then feel that they have to continue the social interaction, or they might feel in his debt in some way, which they might want to avoid. Or the stranger might refuse to close the window. Perhaps he likes the fresh air. And that could create awkwardness for the rest of the journey. Perhaps they have to spend the next 2 hours in this train carriage together. By using covert means, Olivia and Louisa leave the stranger the option to ignore the request without explicitly refusing. And as Sperber and Wilson note, ostensive communication may have social implications that other forms of information transmission do not have. By choosing the covert route, Olivia and Louisa can sidestep these social implications and preserve, or at least avoid risking, the social relationship. So here is a summary table of these roles that I've just talked through, and the definitions defined in terms of the intentions that the speaker or the communicator has towards those individuals. So defined in relevance theoretic cognitive terms, thinking about the intentions of the communicator. And this gives us the framework of participant roles. And the crucial point is that this framework is not just descriptive. It's motivated by these speaker intentions. And in fact, we can map those roles that we've just seen using 4 questions. So we can work through this flowchart and see where a participant falls. So first, is the communicator aware of the participant? If they are not, then the participant is an eavesdropper. And if they are, then you continue down asking the other questions. Second question, does the communicator intend to modify the participant's cognitive environment? If yes, then they are an addressee of some kind. If not, then they are an overhearer, bystander. If they are an addressee, then we have to ask ourselves, is the intention to modify the cognitive environment mutually manifest? If it's not, then we have a covert addressee. If it is, then we move on to that final question. is the intention attempted via a first level or second level ostensive act? If it's a first level ostensive act, then we have a second party addressee. And if it's a second level act, which would usually be an act of showing, then we have a third party addressee. And so these roles, overhearer, eavesdropper, bystander, covert addressee, second and third party addressee, they all fall out naturally from thinking about intentions. So relevance theory gives us a cognitively underpinned way to think about these roles. Each is defined by the awareness of the speaker coupled with their communicative intention. And I'm ending the presentation with some references that I've drawn on to inform my thoughts and my discussions. I hope you found my presentation and my ideas interesting and useful. Thank you very much for listening.